The autumn wind whispered through the nearly bare branches outside, sending golden leaves drifting toward the earth like silent messengers of time. Margaret sat by the window, her wrinkled hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. The house was quiet, too quiet. It had been years since it last felt full, years since the air had carried the sound of laughter, hurried footsteps, or the clatter of dishes as a family gathered around the dining table. Now, the only sound was the soft ticking of the clock, marking the slow passage of another empty evening. Margaret had always imagined growing old with a sense of purpose. She had spent decades as a devoted wife, a loving mother, the pillar of her family. Every day had been filled with something: packing lunches, mending scraped knees, listening to whispered childhood confessions, waiting up late for her husband to return from work. There was never a moment to stop and wonder what her life would be like when all of that was gone. And then, one by one, the days of purpose slipped away. Her husband's passing had been the first fracture, a crack in the foundation of the life they had built together. At first, she had her children to keep her occupied, their voices on the phone, their weekend visits, the demands of their busy lives keeping her tethered to something real. But children grow up, they move away, they create families of their own. She always told herself this was natural, it was the way of life, the way it had always been. And yet, when she woke up to an empty house each morning, when the phone calls became less frequent, when holidays were spent watching others celebrate from a distance, she could not help but wonder if she had become invisible. She was still here. Still breathing, still feeling every ache and every unspoken thought, but the world around her seemed to have moved on. The loneliness was not just a passing emotion. It had settled in, deep and familiar, like an old coat she never meant to wear. She tried to stay busy, reading, knitting, taking slow walks through the neighborhood, but nothing filled the space that had once been occupied by the people she loved. Nothing silenced the quiet ache of feeling forgotten. Then, one evening, something happened that made her question everything. She had been cooking, a simple meal for one, when she became lost in thought. The scent of onions sizzling in the pan reminded her of the many nights she had cooked for her family, the way her husband used to sneak a taste before dinner was served, the way her children used to sit at the counter doing their homework as she moved around the kitchen. The memories wrapped around her so tightly that she didn't notice the burning smell at first. Only when smoke curled toward the ceiling did she realize she had left the stove on too long. Panicked, she rushed to turn it off, coughing as she opened a window to let the smoke escape. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the unease from her mind. She had never been forgetful before. But tonight, she had almost set the kitchen on fire. What if she had not noticed in time? What if no one had been there to help? The next morning, her son called. He had heard about the incident and, though his voice was gentle, there was something in his tone that made her heart sink. He was worried. He and his sister had been talking, he said, about what might be best for her. Maybe it was time, he suggested carefully, for her to consider moving into a place where she could be taken care of, where she wouldn't have to worry about cooking, where she wouldn't be alone. The words struck her harder than she had expected. She knew he meant well, knew that his concern came from love. But all she could hear was the unspoken message beneath it: you can't take care of yourself anymore. You are a burden. That night, she sat by the window again, watching the wind scatter leaves across the lawn. A question pressed heavily against her chest, one she had been too afraid to ask before. Is this all that's left? Have I become nothing more than a shadow of the person I used to be? Margaret's life before Buddhism. Margaret's life had always been defined by purpose. From the moment she became a wife, and later a mother, her days were shaped by the needs of others. She took pride in creating a home filled with warmth, in being the steady presence her family could always rely on. She woke up early every morning to prepare breakfast, packed school lunches, and kissed scraped knees. She knew the favorite meals of each family member, the little quirks that made them unique. She could sense when her husband had a difficult day before he even spoke, could tell when her children were hiding something just by the way they shifted their feet. She was the glue that held everything together, the quiet force that made life move smoothly for those she loved. She never once resented it. If anything, she embraced it. Her life was busy, full of movement, and it gave her a sense of belonging. In the small rituals of daily life, folding laundry, setting the dinner table, staying up late waiting for her teenage son to return home safely, she found meaning. She believed this was what love looked like, not grand gestures, but the everyday sacrifices, the quiet moments of care that often went unnoticed. Years passed. Her children grew up, and one by one, they left home. At first, it was just little things that changed. The sound of doors opening and closing at all hours of the day became less frequent, the grocery list became shorter, the dinner table felt too large for just two people. But she still had her husband, and together, they adjusted to the new rhythm of life. They took slow morning walks, spent evenings reminiscing about the past, and filled the quiet with conversation. Even though the house was no longer bustling with energy, she still had her partner, her anchor. Then one day, she didn't. Losing him was like losing a piece of herself. She had always known that death was inevitable, but nothing had prepared her for the silence that followed. At first, grief came in waves, sudden and overwhelming. She would wake up expecting to hear his footsteps in the hallway, only to be met with emptiness. She would reach for his hand in the middle of the night, only to find the other side of the bed cold. The world around her continued as if nothing had changed, but for her, everything had. People told her that time would make it easier, that she would eventually find a way to move forward. And for a while, she believed them. She tried to fill her days with small tasks, reading books, tending to the garden, visiting the grocery store even when she didn't need much. But the truth was, time did not erase loneliness. It only made it more familiar. Her children called when they could, visited when their schedules allowed, but they had lives of their own. She never wanted to be a burden, never wanted them to feel obligated to take care of her. So, when they asked how she was doing, she smiled and said, "I'm fine." When they offered to help, she reassured them that she didn't need anything. She convinced herself that this was how it was supposed to be. Parents raise their children to be independent, to build their own families. And she had done her job well, but as the years passed, she couldn't ignore the quiet emptiness that had settled into her life. The house, once a place of warmth and noise, had become a reminder of what she had lost. The days blurred together in repetition, waking up, making coffee, staring out the window, eating meals alone, going to bed early just to make the time pass faster. Then, one day, everything shifted. It was a small moment, almost insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but it shook her more than she expected. She had been cooking, something simple, just a meal for one, when she lost track of time. The smell of burning food filled the kitchen before she even realized what had happened. She rushed to turn off the stove, her heart pounding, the smoke curling toward the ceiling like an accusation. For a long time, she stood there, staring at the charred remains of her dinner, feeling something deep and unsettling settle into her chest. That night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't ignore the thought creeping into her mind. If she had made a mistake like this once, what was stopping it from happening again? And what if, next time, there was no one to catch it in time? The following morning, her son called. His voice was gentle, careful, but she could hear the concern beneath it. He had spoken to his sister. They were worried. Maybe, he suggested, it was time for her to consider moving somewhere safer, a place where she wouldn't have to worry about cooking or taking care of a house alone. A place where she could be looked after. Margaret listened, nodding at the right moments, saying she understood. But long after the conversation ended, she sat in the quiet of her living room, staring at the walls that had once held a life full of love and movement. She had spent so many years caring for others. Now, for the first time, she was faced with a question she didn't know how to answer. Who was she, now that no one needed her? A fateful encounter with Buddhism. The morning air was crisp as Margaret stepped outside, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders. She hadn't planned to leave the house that day, but something about the weight of her thoughts made the walls feel smaller, the silence heavier. She walked without direction, letting her feet carry her wherever they pleased. The streets were quiet, the world moving on as if unaware of the loneliness pressing against her chest. She passed by familiar houses, parks where she used to take her children, shops she once visited with her husband. Everything looked the same, yet nothing felt the same. She didn't know how long she had been walking when she found herself standing in front of a small building she had never noticed before. It was modest, almost hidden between two larger structures, with a wooden sign above the entrance. The characters carved into it were unfamiliar to her, but there was something about the place that made her pause. A gentle scent of incense drifted through the air, carrying with it a sense of calm she hadn't felt in years. Without thinking, she stepped inside. The interior was simple yet inviting. Soft light filtered through paper windows, casting warm shadows on the floor. A few people sat quietly on cushions, their eyes closed, their breath slow and steady. The air was thick with stillness, but not the kind that felt empty. This was different. This was peace. Margaret hesitated, unsure if she should be there. Before she could turn to leave, a gentle voice broke the silence. "Welcome." She turned to see an elderly monk standing nearby, his robe flowing around him like a river at rest. His face was lined with age, but his eyes carried a lightness, a kindness that made her feel as though he had been expecting her. I didn't mean to intrude," she said, suddenly feeling out of place. "There is no intrusion," he replied. "Only arrival." Something in his words made her pause. She had spent so much of her life feeling like an afterthought, like a piece of the past that no longer fit in the present. But here, in this quiet space, she felt seen. The monk gestured toward a small cushion. "Would you like to sit?" Margaret hesitated, then nodded. She lowered herself onto the cushion, mimicking the posture of the others around her. The monk sat beside her, the folds of his robe settling around him like the roots of an old tree. "What brings you here today?" he asked gently. Margaret opened her mouth to speak but found that she didn't have an answer. She had simply been walking, wondering, searching. She let out a slow breath. "I don't know," she admitted. "I suppose I just feel lost." The monk nodded as if he understood completely. "Lost is a place we all visit," he said. "But it is not where we must stay." She looked at him, something stirring in her chest. "How do you leave?" The monk was silent for a moment before he spoke again. "By learning to be where you are." Margaret frowned slightly. "I don't understand." He smiled. "That's all right. Understanding is not needed to begin. Just breathe." She hesitated, but followed his instruction. She closed her eyes and took a breath. In. Out. For the first time in a long while, she noticed the way the air felt as it entered her lungs, the way it left just as easily. She noticed the way her shoulders had been tense without realizing it, the way her thoughts had been running without direction, much like her steps earlier that morning. They sat like that for a while, in silence. And in that silence, something shifted. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but Margaret felt it. A moment, just one, where she wasn't caught in the past or tangled in the fear of the future. A moment where she simply existed. When she finally opened her eyes, the monk was watching her, a knowing softness in his gaze. "What did you notice?" he asked. Margaret thought for a moment. "That I was breathing." He nodded. "Yes. And for that moment, you were not lost. You were here." She let the words settle into her bones. She had spent so many years chasing something, purpose, belonging, meaning, only to find herself caught between what was and what might be. But in that brief moment, she had simply been. And for the first time in a long time, that had been enough. The monk stood, offering her a small bow before turning to leave her with her thoughts. As he walked away, he spoke one final time. "You are always welcome here." Margaret sat there for a long while, watching the way the light shifted through the windows, listening to the sound of her own breath. She knew she would return. Something inside her had changed. She wasn't sure what it was yet, but she knew one thing for certain: she was ready to find out. The journey of practicing Buddhism, small but meaningful changes. The morning after Margaret's first visit to the temple, she woke up feeling something unfamiliar, a quiet sense of curiosity. It wasn't a sudden revelation or a dramatic shift, but rather a small opening, like the first hint of dawn after a long night. The words of the monk lingered in her mind. "Lost is a place we all visit, but it is not where we must stay." For the first time in a long time, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as lost as she had thought. She returned to the temple a few days later, unsure of what she was looking for but drawn by the peace she had felt in that quiet room. The monk greeted her with the same gentle warmth as before, as if she had always belonged there. She sat on the same cushion, feeling the weight of silence settle around her, and closed her eyes. At first, meditation felt impossible. Her Thoughts wandered, pulling her in every direction. She thought about the past, her husband's laughter, the weight of her newborn son in her arms, the way the house used to feel when it was full. Then her mind leaped forward, worrying about the future, about growing older, about what would happen if she could no longer take care of herself. The stillness was uncomfortable, even frightening. But the monk had told her not to fight it. Let the thoughts come, he had said. Then let them go, like leaves floating down a river. So she tried. She sat with her memories, acknowledged them, and then let them drift away. She sat with her fears, felt them in her chest, and then allowed them to loosen their grip. And in between the noise, there were tiny moments, brief and fleeting, where she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Presence. A sense that she was here, now, in this moment, and that it was enough. It wasn't easy. Some days, the silence felt unbearable, and she would open her eyes after only a few minutes, her heart pounding with restlessness. Other days, she found herself settling in more easily, letting the rhythm of her breath anchor her. She started with 5 minutes a day, then 10. She didn't force it. She simply let it become part of her routine, the same way she had once made time for cooking or folding laundry. Over time, she began to notice other changes. One afternoon, she was looking through an old photo album when she caught herself bracing for the familiar ache of nostalgia. For years, she had avoided these photographs, afraid that they would only remind her of what she had lost. But this time, something was different. She looked at a picture of her husband, frozen in time with his easy smile, and instead of grief, she felt gratitude. How lucky I was to have loved him, she thought. The sadness was still there, but it no longer felt unbearable. It no longer defined the memory. She began paying attention to small joys she had once overlooked, the way sunlight filtered through the trees in the late afternoon, the way her hands felt warm around a cup of tea, the way the air smelled after it rained. She started tending to her garden again, watching the tiny sprouts push their way through the soil. She had always loved gardening, but before, she had seen it only as a task, something to be completed. Now, she noticed the process. She felt the dirt beneath her fingertips, marveled at the way a flower bloomed without hesitation, without fear. She thought about what the monk had told her about impermanence, that everything in life was always changing, that clinging to the past only created suffering. And as she watched the petals fall from the branches, she realized he was right. Nothing stayed the same, but that didn't mean it wasn't beautiful while it lasted. One day, as she was walking home from the temple, she passed by a park where a young mother sat on a bench, cradling a newborn against her chest. Margaret slowed her steps, watching as the woman rocked the baby gently, whispering words only they could hear. A familiar feeling rose in her chest, the longing for days that had passed, for the time when she had held her own children the same way. But instead of letting the ache consume her, she simply stood there, breathing. That was my time, she thought. And this is hers, she smiled, feeling something shift inside her. The sadness was still there, but it was softer now. It no longer felt like a weight pressing down on her. It felt like a part of her story, something she could carry without letting it define her. When she reached home, she sat by the window, watching the leaves move in the wind. She had spent so many years resisting change, fearing it, mourning what had been lost. But now, as she watched the golden leaves swirl and dance before finally settling to the ground, she thought, maybe letting go isn't the same as losing something. Maybe it's just making room for whatever comes next. A new event. Margaret's greatest challenge. Margaret had begun to feel lighter. The weight of the past, which had once pressed so heavily on her chest, had started to lift, piece by piece, like mist dissolving in the morning sun. She still missed her husband, still felt a quiet longing when she thought of the life she once had, but it no longer consumed her. She had learned to sit with those feelings rather than run from them. She had found solace in her meditation practice, in the gentle rhythm of her breath, in the understanding that life was always changing, always moving. For the first time in years, she felt at peace. Then, one evening, the phone rang. Margaret answered with a familiar warmth, expecting to hear the voice of her son or daughter. But the voice on the other end was different. It was shaky, hesitant. A friend of hers, an old friend, Helen, was calling. The moment Margaret heard her voice, she knew something was wrong. Helen had been one of the few friends Margaret had stayed close with after her husband passed. They had known each other For decades, first as young mothers, then as widows navigating the loneliness of later years. They met for tea, called each other often, shared memories and worries and laughter. Helen had always been a source of comfort, a reminder that Margaret was not alone, but this call was different. Helen's voice was quiet, almost fragile. She told Margaret she hadn't been feeling well, that she had gone to the doctor. There was a long pause before she finally said the words. It was cancer. Advanced. The doctors said there wasn't much they could do. Margaret gripped the phone tightly, her breath catching in her throat. She wanted to say something, anything, but no words came. After a long silence, she finally managed to whisper, "I'm so sorry, Helen." Helen let out a small, tired sigh. "I am too," she said. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the stillness of the room suddenly unbearable. She had lost so many people in her life, her husband, her parents, old friends who had faded away with time. But Helen had always been there. And now, she would be gone too. The thought sent a sharp wave of grief through her. Hadn't she learned to accept impermanence? Hadn't she spent months practicing letting go? She had thought she understood. She had told herself she was ready to face whatever life brought her. But now, confronted with the reality of losing someone she loved again, she felt just as helpless as she had all those years ago when she stood in the quiet of her home after her husband's funeral. Over the next few weeks, Margaret visited Helen as often as she could. Some days, Helen was strong enough to talk, and they would reminisce about old times, laughing at stories they had told each other 100 times before. Other days, Helen was too weak to speak, and Margaret would simply sit by her bedside, holding her hand, listening to the rhythmic beeping of the machines. One afternoon, as Margaret sat beside her, Helen turned her head slightly and whispered, "Are you scared?" Margaret's throat tightened. She knew what Helen was asking. She looked down at their hands, at the way Helen's fingers had grown thin, almost translucent. She wanted to say no. She wanted to say that she had learned to accept death, that she had found peace in knowing that everything was temporary. But in that moment, she couldn't lie. "Yes," she admitted softly. "I am." Helen nodded, as if she had expected that answer. "Me too," she whispered. Margaret stayed with her that evening, long after the nurses had dimmed the lights. She sat in the silence, listening to the sound of Helen's breathing, slow and steady, like waves lapping at the shore. A few days later, Helen was gone. Margaret thought she had prepared herself, but when the news came, it hit her with a force she hadn't expected. The house felt empty again, the silence pressing in from all sides. She sat by the window, staring out at the trees, feeling as though she had lost her footing. She had spent months practicing presence, learning to let go, but now she found herself drowning in grief all over again. One evening, she returned to the temple, seeking the same peace she had found there before. The monk saw her as she entered, and without a word, gestured for her to sit. She closed her eyes, trying to breathe, trying to settle the storm inside her. But the pain was too sharp, the loss too fresh. After a long silence, she finally whispered, "Why does it still hurt so much?" The monk didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, steady. "Because you loved her." Margaret opened her eyes, her vision blurred with unshed tears. "The goal of this practice is not to erase grief," he continued. "It is to learn how to hold it with kindness. To allow it to exist without letting it consume you." Margaret took a shaky breath. "I thought I had accepted impermanence," she admitted. "I thought I was ready." The monk nodded. "We are never truly ready. But we can learn to embrace change rather than resist it." Margaret sat with those words, letting them settle into her heart. She knew she would grieve Helen for a long time. She knew there would be moments when the loss felt unbearable. But she also knew now that grief was not something to be feared. It was a sign that love had existed, that something beautiful had once been part of her life, and maybe, just maybe, she could learn to carry it, not as a burden, but as a reminder of everything that had been. Life after enlightenment, happiness from simple things. The morning light filtered gently through the curtains as Margaret sat at her kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea. The steam curled upward, disappearing into the air, and she simply watched it, taking in the moment without rushing past it. There was a time when mornings like this would have felt unbearably lonely, when silence pressed against her like an unwelcome guest. But now, the quiet felt different. It wasn't emptiness, it was peace. She had spent most of her life chasing after something, purpose, belonging, meaning. For years, she had believed that happiness was tied to the people around her, to the roles she played, to the certainty of what came next. But life had shown her otherwise. It had taken things from her, people she loved, a sense of familiarity. The structure of the world she once knew. She had resisted those changes at first, fearing what was left in their absence. But now, she understood. Happiness was not in holding on. It was in allowing things to be as they were. She had learned to find joy in the smallest of moments, in the details she once overlooked. She noticed the way the sunlight danced on the hardwood floor in the late afternoon, the way a gentle breeze carried the scent of earth after it rained. She took slow walks through the neighborhood, feeling the ground beneath her feet, truly listening to the birds in the trees rather than letting them become background noise. She found comfort in the rhythm of daily life, the way water felt on her skin when she washed her hands, the softness of her blanket when she wrapped it around her shoulders at night. She still missed her husband. She still thought of Helen. There were days when she felt the familiar pang of loss, when old memories surfaced like waves against the shore. But grief no longer felt like a weight pulling her under. Instead, it was something she carried with her, something softened by time and by acceptance. She no longer ran from it, no longer tried to push it away. When she missed them, she let herself miss them. When sadness came, she welcomed it, knowing that it, too, would pass. One afternoon, Margaret sat in her small garden, her hands resting in the dirt as she tended to a patch of wildflowers she had planted earlier that year. She had never thought of herself as someone with a green thumb, but she had come to love the practice of gardening, the patience it required, the lessons it taught her. She had learned that she couldn't force a plant to bloom before its time. That she couldn't control the rain or the sun, that all she could do was nurture it and trust the process. It was, in many ways, a reflection of everything she had learned about life. As she brushed soil from her fingertips, she noticed a woman walking past her gate, one of her neighbors, a woman around her age whom she had only exchanged polite nods with before. On impulse, Margaret smiled and waved. The woman hesitated for a moment, then returned the smile, stepping closer. "Your garden is lovely," the woman said. Margaret looked down at the tiny sprouts still pushing their way through the earth and chuckled. "It's a work in progress." The woman nodded, then paused. "Would you like to go for a walk sometime?" A few months ago, Margaret might have hesitated, might have thought of reasons to say no. But today, she simply smiled and said, "I'd like that." Later that evening, as she sat by the window, watching the sky turn shades of pink and orange, she thought about how different her life had become, not in a grand, dramatic way, but in the quiet, subtle shifts that had changed everything. She was no longer waiting for life to return to what it had once been. She was no longer looking for something outside of herself to make her whole. She had found happiness, not in some distant future, not in the past she had lost, but right here, in this very moment. In the warmth of a cup of tea. In the feeling of soil between her fingers. In the kindness of a stranger who might become a friend, and for the first time in a long time, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. Margaret sat on her porch, a cup of tea resting between her hands, watching as the last light of the day faded into the horizon. The sky was painted in soft shades of gold and lavender, shifting gently, effortlessly, just as everything in life did. She had spent so many years fearing change, resisting the passage of time, clinging to what once was. But now, she understood that life was not meant to be held onto. It was meant to be lived, moment by moment, just like this. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the loneliness she had once feared, the grief that had threatened to consume her, the uncertainty that had made her question her place in the world. She had believed, for so long, that happiness was something external, something that could be lost or taken away. But now, she knew better. Happiness was never in the past. It was never in the future. It was always here, waiting to be noticed. Waiting to be embraced. She had learned that peace was not the absence of pain but the ability to hold it gently, without fear. That love did not disappear with loss but lived on in memory, in gratitude, in the quiet moments of remembrance. She had learned that letting go was not the same as giving up, that accepting impermanence did not mean loving any less. In fact, it meant loving more, without attachment, without expectations, without the need to control what could not be controlled. As the evening air cooled, she smiled to herself, feeling a deep sense of contentment. She knew there would still be difficult days, moments of sadness, times when grief would resurface. But she also knew that she had the strength to face them, to sit with them, to let them pass like the changing seasons. Because now, she understood that everything in life was temporary, and that was what made it so precious. To anyone who had ever felt lost, to anyone who had ever questioned their place in the world, to anyone who had ever feared the passage of time, Margaret wished she could say one thing: you are not alone. Life is not something to be held onto, but something to be experienced, fully and deeply, without fear of what comes next. Take a breath. Feel the warmth of the sun on your skin. Listen to the wind as it moves through the trees. Notice the small joys that have always been there, waiting for you to see them. Because in the end, happiness is not something you find. It is something you choose, again and again, in every moment you are given. If this story has touched you, if you have ever felt the way Margaret once did, take a moment now to breathe, to reflect, to embrace the present. And if you feel inclined, share your thoughts, your journey, your own moments of peace. Because none of us have to walk this path alone. We are all connected, all learning, all finding our way, one breath at a time.